In previous videos, we've shown how you can use this helper function, the dialog helper underbar JS populate dialog, to generate JavaScript from an input Xbasic variable that defines the data that you'd like to populate the dialog with. So we showed how basically the dialog got populated from this dot variable over here. In this video, we're going to discuss a second helper function that is useful for actually creating this dot variable in the first place by making queries against a SQL database. So if we go back to the Xbasic code editor here and we look at this very simple example first, and then we'll get to a much more complex example next, you can see here we have a second helper function called getData to populate dialog, and this helper function takes as its input an Xbasic array that defines data for different sections of a dialog. So in this first example that we're going to look at here, we have a very simple data structure. This is a dialog with no repeating sections, so this is just the top level of the dialog, and we've defined an arbitrary alias property, then a SQL select statement that defines the query that we would like to execute to retrieve the data, a filter, so in this case we've said customer ID equals 2, a connection string, we specified that we're going to be using portable SQL, arguments XML, in this case is blank, but had this filter here referenced an argument like customer ID equals : what ID, then we would have defined the argument value inside this property over there. Then we have a field to variable map, which is important because the physical field names in the table that we're querying might not match the names of the controls on the dialog. So in this particular case, we actually have a field in our customer table that has spaces in the name called name with space, which is not a legal control name on a dialog. So on the dialog we would probably map that to a field with a different name. So in this case we've said, say, field with space. And then we've also said that the physical table called customer has a field called ship underbar address 1, and we'd like to map that to a control called ship address 1. And then finally we've left the display format property blank for now. We'll discuss that later. So when we run this code over here, we can see that what we get back is inside PX we get back three properties here. We get back a property called has error, which in this case is false, error text, which in this case is blank, and then we also get another property back called Xbasic, which defines an Xbasic script from there to there that you could run to actually populate this dot variable called P. So here, for example, is customer ID equals 2, which in fact is correct because we asked for customer ID equals 2. And then here are all of the other values for that record in our dot variable over here. So by just doing an evaluate template on px.xbasic, we would then be defining this dot variable P, which would then be available to us to pass in to this to the populate dialog helper. So what we've shown here is a very simple example of how this dot variable here can be created by a second helper function called getData to populate dialog. So in the next video we're going to discuss how this sections array here can be defined for much more complex cases where you have dialogs with one or more repeating sections. Thank you. In the previous video we discussed how the getData to populate dialog helper function can be used, and the example that we had was a very simple structure. It was a dialog with no repeating sections. So now let's go to a much more complex example, and you can see here in this example we actually have a dialog with 3 sections. So the dialog has customer information at the top level, then it has invoice header at the second level, so this data would be contained in a repeating section. So this would be showing all of the invoices for a given customer. And then we have a second repeating section called Invoice Items, which shows all of the invoice items for a particular invoice in the Invoice Header repeating section. So for example, if the second row in the Invoice Header repeating section had focus, we would be seeing the invoice items for that particular invoice header. So now let's look at the structure of this sections array, which is being constructed here to pass into the getData to populate dialog helper function. So the first item in the sections array is the definition for the top level of the dialog, and since this is not linked to any child queries, the first section is simple. You don't need to define parent alias or link alias fields. So you can see here we're just doing a query to retrieve the data from the customer table for customer ID equals 2. Here's our field to variable map. Now let's move on to the second item in the array, and this is Invoice Header. This data for this query will be used to populate the repeating section with this ID. So this is the ID of the repeating section where Invoice Header will be put. Here is the query, select star from Invoice Header, and then here is how Invoice Header is linked to its parent alias, which is customer. So it's linked on customer ID and customer ID. So if the link was on multiple fields, you would put a comma delimited list of fields here and then a comma delimited list of fields over here. But in this particular case, the link is on a single field. Then you can see that in our field map, we've got customer ID equals cust ID 2, and that's very important because both the customer table and the invoice header table in this particular example both have a field called customer _ ID, but a dialog can't have more than one control with the same name. So inside the invoice header repeating section, the customer ID is going to be called cust ID 2, and we therefore need to map the physical field customer ID to the logical field inside to the physical variable name cust ID 2, which represents that field in the repeating section. Then let's move on to the final item in the array, which is the invoice items. And again, you can see here that we've defined our query select star from invoice items, and we let's see, do we still have our filter? Yeah, we do. We have a filter on this over here of quantity is greater than what quantity, and therefore we've defined inside the arguments property the definition of that what quantity argument, and we've set its value to 1. So let's pause now and then continue our discussion. So we're continuing our discussion of the getData to populate dialog helper function for this complex example where we have a dialog with 2 repeating sections that are organized in a parent-child relationship. So the invoice header repeating section is the parent of the invoice items repeating section. So this is the definition of the query for the invoice items repeating section, but it's important to point out that that this query here is going to be based on this property over here in sections 2 current row 1. So what this indicates is that when we do the query for invoice items and we retrieve the value for the parent linking field, which is invoice number, we want to retrieve this field from the first row of the invoice header repeating section. If we had entered a 2 over there, then we would be retrieving this invoice number for on the parent side from the second row of the repeating section. So let's go ahead now and actually run the script so we can see what data is returned by this getData to populate dialog. So when we go ahead and we run it now, we can see first of all that this says field with space, because that's how we mapped. If you look, let's just quickly go back and look at the mapping over here. We said that the physical field name with space gets mapped to the control field with space. So what we see in our dot variable is field with space, because these property names over here in the dot variable correspond to the variable names on the dialog that we're trying to populate. So then we can see next that we're going to have data in a repeating section for invoice header. So here we go, and there is our array. So you can see there's our array called container1, because that's the alias of that repeating section. And then here is all of the data for the invoice header rows that match customer number 2. So you can see there's the first invoice, which is invoice number 18, the second invoice, which is number 78, the third is number 80, number 83, etc. So this particular customer happened to have, say, it looks like 4 invoices, and now we're on to the second repeating section over here, which is container number 2, and we can see that since we indicated that we wanted to read the data from the first repeating section row, which happened to be invoice number 18, all of the records in the second repeating section, which are the line items, are for invoice number 18 over here. So you can see these are all for invoice number 18, and these are all of the line items for invoice number 18. Then finally we can see the JavaScript to set the repeating section active row, and we can see that we're setting the active row in both cases to row number 1. So if I were to go back now and then change this from current row 1 to current row 2, then the invoice items that I would see in container number 2 would match 78. So let's scroll down and see in fact if that is the case. So no, it's not. So let's go and see what we did wrong. So we put the current row on the wrong array, so it needs to be on array number 2, which is the invoice header array. So let's go ahead now and then run it again, and then scroll down, and now in fact we do see invoice number 83. So let's pause now and then continue in the next video. So we're continuing our discussion on the helper function that will populate the dot variable that gets passed into the second helper function, which generates the JavaScript. So now that we have executed this function and we've looked now to see what properties are in this function, has error, error text, and then Xbasic, we can continue with our example. So let me now comment out this function over here. And now you can see that inside PX we're going to check to see whether there was an error. If there was no error, then we're going to basically evaluate px.xbasic, which will give us the dot variable p. So if I were to go now and just put in a debug 1 over there and then run this, you can see now as we step into this evaluate template, we're actually now executing the Xbasic that was generated, and so now we're defining this dot variable called p, and we can just continue through this. This is defining the dot variable that contains all the data, and then finally once we have that dot variable called p, we then pass that into our populate dialog helper function, and we show here inside this show var what js.set repeating sections looks like, what set active row looks like, and what populate controls looks like. So let's go ahead now and run it. So you can see now that that set repeating section for container 1 is set to 4 because there are 4 invoice headers, and also set repeating section active row is set to 2 because we specified that we wanted to read the data from the second repeating section row in invoice header. So here's the array that populates the here's the JavaScript object to populate the top level of the dialog component. Here is the JavaScript object to populate the 4 rows of the invoice header repeating section, and then let's just pause here. And we're not seeing any data for populating the invoice items, and I believe the reason is that invoice number 83 didn't have any invoice items on it. So because there were no invoice items on this for the second row, there were for the second invoice header, there were no invoice items generated. So let's go back now and change this back to a 1 over here, and now look at the code again. So there's our invoice. Here's the JavaScript to populate the object for the 4 invoice header records, invoice number 18, 78, 80, and 83. And then here's the JavaScript to populate the object for the invoice items. So you can see here are my invoice items, and there are the 5 invoice items to populate the second repeating section. So let's go back now and look here. So now we see here we're populating the first repeating section for invoice header with 4 rows, the second repeating section for invoice items with 5 rows. We're setting focus on the first repeating section row to row number 1, and we're setting focus on the second repeating section row to row number 2. So this JavaScript that has been generated now by this helper function can now be emitted by your server-side event handler to populate the dialog. And in this case, you can see that we've handled a fairly complex data structure quite easily using these 2 helper functions. Thanks very much for watching.